Open book Miss Marple and Murder in the Mystery of the Crooked Lane. Chapter 1. A Village Afternoon. The village of Willowbrook had an air of timeless calm about it. Cobbled lanes curved between rows of ivy-clad cottages, and the church bells rang softly in the distance, marking the slow passing of another warm afternoon. Children played near the green, the baker's bell jingled as customers came and went, and gossip drifted in gentle waves across the square, just as it always had. Miss Jane Marple, seated by her lace-curtained window with her knitting, might have appeared to be absorbed in her yarn. Yet her sharp, observant eyes wandered now and then toward the lane below. Few things escaped Miss Marple's notice, though she rarely allowed others to realize how much she had seen. This afternoon, the peace of Willowbrook was slightly disturbed. A heated conversation carried itself across the still air. Mr. Henry Pritchard, the village shopkeeper, was arguing loudly with his delivery boy at the corner of Crooked Lane. Pritchard's ruddy face and stiff gestures betrayed temper, while the boy's sullen answers suggested a quarrel that had been simmering for some time. It was nothing extraordinary for a village. Men quarreled, boys sulked, and words were spoken more sharply than intended. Yet something in the tone caught Miss Marple's ear. She paused in her knitting, tilting her head slightly. There was an urgency there, not just irritation. Later that same evening, as dusk fell and the lamps were lit, Crooked Lane grew oddly silent. The usual hum of footsteps and idle chatter had died away. A dog barked once, uneasily. Then came the sound, sharp, sudden, chilling in the evening stillness. A cry, cut short, followed by the hollow thud of something striking the ground. Villagers hurried from their cottages, lamps raised, eyes wide. Near the shadow of the old stone wall on Crooked Lane lay Henry Pritchard, motionless, his hat rolled aside on the cobbles. Someone gasped. Someone else crossed themselves. By the time the constable arrived, the lane was crowded with whispers. "Murder," someone said in a hushed voice. "A robbery gone wrong," suggested another. But here, in Willowbrook. And as the lantern light flickered over Pritchard's still features, Miss Marple, standing quietly at the edge of the gathering, said nothing at all. She only adjusted her spectacles, her eyes calm, thoughtful, and already searching. Open book Miss Marple and Murder in the Mystery of the Crooked Lane. Chapter 2. Whispers in Willowbrook. By morning, the quiet lanes of Willowbrook were anything but quiet. Word of Henry Pritchard's death had flown faster than the church bells could chime. From the post office to the tea shop, from the blacksmith's forge to the vicarage, every conversation began and ended with the same dreadful word, murder. At Mrs. Larkin's tea shop, where the scent of fresh scones mixed with the sharper tang of scandal, voices buzzed like bees in a hive. "It must have been a robbery," declared Mrs. Tompkins, her spoon rattling against her cup. "Mark my words, that poor man carried his week's takings home with him. A stranger must have followed him down Crooked Lane." "Strangers don't come to Willowbrook at night," countered Mr. Elkins, the butcher. "No, it was someone local. Someone who knew his habits. That's the way of it." A hush fell for a moment, as the possibility turned every familiar face into a potential suspect. Mrs. Tompkins leaned forward conspiratorially. "I heard," she whispered, "that he and his delivery boy quarreled something fierce only yesterday. The constable was told, you know." At another table, Miss Marple stirred her tea delicately. Her blue eyes flicked from speaker to speaker, noting not only words but tones, glances, and the small betrayals of expression. She said nothing, but knitted together more than wool in her quiet mind. Meanwhile, Constable Briggs had made his presence felt by clumping about the lane with an air of grave importance. A decent man, though not given to subtleties, Briggs had already announced that robbery was the most likely explanation. He promised a thorough search of the hedgerows, as though a murderer might have dropped both conscience and weapon amidst the brambles. By noon, fear had crept into the very marrow of the village. Mothers pulled their children closer, shutters were drawn earlier than usual, and even the genial vicar walked with uncharacteristic briskness when passing through Crooked Lane. And yet, behind every fearful glance lay curiosity. People needed to know who could do such a thing. In Willowbrook, gossip was both a shield and a weapon. It turned neighbors into suspects and suspects into villains before the constable had even sharpened his pencil. Only Miss Marple remained calm, her needles clicking softly that afternoon by the fire. She remembered Pritchard's raised voice, the boys' sulky defiance, the curious intensity of their quarrel. But she also remembered something else, something most of the villagers had overlooked. When the body was found, Pritchard's pocket watch had been missing, true enough. But his wallet, stuffed with banknotes, was untouched. It was a small detail. Yet for Miss Marple, it was enough to set her thoughts spinning in a different direction entirely. Open book Miss Marple and Murder in the Mystery of the Crooked Lane. Chapter 3. Small Things Noticed. The morning after Henry Pritchard's death, Crooked Lane seemed to wear a different face. Once just a bend of cobblestones between cottages, now it bore the uneasy weight of a crime scene. Children were ushered past quickly, as though the shadows themselves carried danger, and villagers lowered their voices when they neared the stone wall where Pritchard had been found. Constable Briggs busied himself, puffing with self-importance as he inspected the lane yet again. He bent to study the ground, tapped his notebook and muttered about footprints, though the heavy dew had blurred them into indistinguishable patches. Miss Marple, standing nearby with her basket of knitting wool, ostensibly for a visit to the haberdashery, paused as if to rest. Her eyes, sharper than Briggs's, traced the cobbles. There was something odd, a torn scrap of fabric caught on the wall's rough edge. Pale blue. Cotton. She tucked the detail away quietly, saying nothing. That afternoon, the village buzzed with yet more talk. At the grocer's, Mrs. Elkins whispered to Miss Marple, "The boy, Arthur, Mr. Pritchard's delivery lad, he hasn't been seen since last night. Ran off, they say. That proves it, doesn't it?" Miss Marple only smiled faintly. "Does it, dear?" she asked and went on her way. Later, as she crossed the green, she noticed Mr. Trumbull, the postmaster, behaving rather curiously. Usually a genial man, he avoided her gaze, fumbling with the keys to the post office door, though the lock had never troubled him before. His hands trembled slightly. Miss Marple wondered why the death of Pritchard should unsettle him so much. After all, they had not been close, at least, not publicly. At tea that evening, Miss Marple sat with her friend Mrs. Weatherby, who could never resist repeating what she'd heard. "They say Pritchard had debts, Jane," Mrs. Weatherby said, leaning closer. "Gambling, some whisper. Others say he lent money about the village, and not all of it kindly. If that's true, well, it's a wonder someone didn't strike him down sooner." Miss Marple listened, nodding. Debts, quarrels, secret dealings, all seeds of resentment. And murder, she knew well, seldom grew from nothing. As the clock chimed 8, a faint knock sounded at Miss Marple's door. She opened it to find young Emily Pritchard, Henry's niece, her eyes red from crying. I don't know who else to turn to, Miss Marple," she whispered. "They all think Arthur did it, but he couldn't have. He was with me down by the river when Uncle was killed." Miss Marple looked at her kindly, ushering her inside. The knitting lay forgotten in her lap as her mind began to weave a different pattern altogether. For if Arthur was innocent, then someone else in Willowbrook was guilty, and that someone was clever enough to let suspicion fall on a quarrelsome boy. Open book Miss Marple and Murder in the Mystery of the Crooked Lane. Chapter 4. The Wrong Suspect. By the following morning, Willowbrook awoke to the sight of Constable Briggs marching down the high street with young Arthur Bennet in tow. The boy's cap was pulled low, his face pale, and though he walked with reluctance, he did not resist. Villagers spilled into the street, murmuring with that curious mixture of fear and relief that follows the naming of a suspect. "There now," said Mrs. Tompkins, tugging at her shawl. "I said it from the start, didn't I? Quarreling one day, murder the next. Clear as daylight. Clear as mud, more like," muttered the blacksmith, though not loud enough for Briggs to hear. Briggs himself was puffed up with pride. "Caught him loitering near the station," he announced to anyone within earshot. "Trying to slip away." And with this, he held up a small brass watch chain. "Recognize it, don't you? Mr. Pritchard's. Found in the boy's satchel." Gasps followed. Arthur's voice cracked as he protested. "I never took it. I don't know how it got there, I swear it." But his words were drowned out by the swell of gossip. Miss Marple, who had paused outside the baker's, watched quietly. Her eyes rested not on Arthur but on the watch chain. She noticed a curious detail. Though tarnished in places, its clasp bore no trace of the wear she recalled on Pritchard's own chain, which she had seen many times as he leaned across his shop counter. This one looked newer. By evening, the village had settled into a brittle calm. The killer's caught, people said with certainty. Housewives unlatched their shutters, and the vicar's wife even ventured to walk Crooked Lane without her husband at her side. Yet in her sitting room, Miss Marple sat knitting by lamplight, her needles clicking steadily. She could not share in their relief, for she had spoken with Emily Pritchard that very afternoon, the girl pale and tearful as she insisted Arthur was with her by the river when the murder occurred. Emily had no reason to lie. Indeed, to admit such a thing risked gossip of a different, crueler sort. And then there was that scrap of pale blue fabric Miss Marple had noticed caught on the wall. Arthur's jacket, she recalled, was brown corduroy, not blue cotton. Miss Marple sighed softly. The police had their suspect, the villagers had their certainty, but the truth, she felt, was still out there, hiding in the shadows of Crooked Lane. And as she set down her knitting, she thought, the real killer must be rather pleased with himself tonight. Open book Miss Marple and Murder in the Mystery of the Crooked Lane. Chapter 5 Secrets in the Shadows. Though Arthur Bennett now languished in the small holding cell by the constable's office, Willowbrook had not grown quieter. Rather, the capture of a suspect seemed to have unlatched tongues that had long been waiting for the chance to wag. At the tea shop, Mrs. Tompkins confided in Mrs. Larkin that she had always known Pritchard was a harsh employer, given to temper. "I once saw him strike Arthur across the head for dropping a loaf," she said triumphantly, as if cruelty itself proved motive. But not all stories painted Pritchard as master and Arthur as victim. At the grocer's, Mr. Elkins leaned close to whisper, "Pritchard was no innocent, mind you. He lent money, at interest too steep for Christian decency. Why, only last month he threatened old Trumbull at the post office over some unpaid sum." This caught Miss Marple's attention. She remembered Mr. Trumbull's trembling hands and averted eyes. Debts, then. Debts could weigh heavily indeed. That afternoon she paid a polite call to Mrs. Weatherby, who always managed to know more than most. Over tea, the widow leaned forward, lowering her voice. "They say Pritchard was keeping company with Mrs. Finch, you know, the dressmaker's wife. Quite the scandal, though it was done in whispers. Finch himself is a jealous man, Jane. Green-eyed and short-tempered. Why, only last week he was seen arguing with Pritchard outside the public-house." Miss Marple stirred her tea thoughtfully. A jealous husband. A moneylender's threats. A boy's quarrel with his employer. Motives were plentiful in Willowbrook, but motives alone did not make murderers. When she stepped out into the lane, the evening air carried with it the hum of hushed conversations behind lace curtains. Everyone seemed to be speaking of Pritchard now, as though his death had freed the village to say what it had long suppressed. Miss Marple paused at Crooked Lane once more. The scrap of blue fabric was gone. Someone, perhaps Briggs, had taken it. But in the dust near the wall she noticed a faint impression, half smudged, the sole of a shoe. Narrower than a man's, lighter, perhaps a woman's. Odd, she thought, that Constable Briggs had overlooked it. She continued home, her mind knitting together threads of suspicion. Arthur's guilt seemed less certain with every passing hour. If anything, the boy had been convenient. Too convenient. The truth, Miss Marple suspected, lay not with the obvious but with the hidden. And in Willowbrook, there were shadows enough for many secrets. Open book Miss Marple and Murder in the Mystery of the Crooked Lane. Chapter 6. An Unexpected Turn. 2 days had passed since Arthur's arrest, and Willowbrook began to breathe more easily. Housewives lingered in the market. Children dared to play by the green once more, and Constable Briggs walked about with the proud air of a man convinced he had delivered justice. But Miss Marple's mind remained restless. She had gone that afternoon to purchase thread at Mrs. Finch's shop. The dressmaker's wife, pale and distracted, pricked her finger twice on a needle, her composure frayed. When Miss Marple gently remarked upon it, Mrs. Finch started as if from a guilty dream. That night, as the village prepared for sleep, a cry split the stillness. Windows flew open, lamps flickered to life, and soon a small crowd gathered outside the post office. Inside, Mr. Trumbull lay slumped across the counter, blood matting his hair where a heavy blow had struck. He was alive, barely, moaning faintly as the doctor was summoned. A window at the back stood open, its latch broken clean away. Constable Briggs, red-faced and rattled, sputtered at the gathering crowd. "A robbery, that's what this is. The same villain, no doubt. Must have had an accomplice. But don't you worry, we've got the main culprit locked away." Miss Marple, standing quietly near the door, said nothing. She had noticed the overturned inkwell, the smear of blue on the counter's edge, paint or cloth she could not yet tell, and the curious fact that Trumbull's safe, though damaged, had not been emptied. Robbery seemed less the motive than a silencing. As she walked home through the cool night air, the lane seemed darker than before, the shadows deeper. A second crime so soon after the first. Arthur, locked in his cell, could not have raised a hand against Mr. Trumbull. That much was certain. And if the boy were innocent of this crime, then perhaps of the first as well. Miss Marple clasped her shawl more tightly around her shoulders. The pattern was shifting, the threads of truth slowly revealing themselves. But one thing she knew with absolute certainty: the murderer of Henry Pritchard was still free in Willowbrook. Open book Miss Marple and Murder in the Mystery of the Crooked Lane. Chapter 7: Threads of Suspicion. The morning after the attack on Mr. Trumbull, Willowbrook was awash in gossip. In the grocer's shop, Mrs. Tompkins declared loudly that burglars had come from outside the village. At the bakery, Mr. Elkins insisted it must have been Arthur's associates, though none could name who such friends might be. Everywhere, tongues wagged and suspicions multiplied. Miss Marple, as was her habit, moved quietly among them. She listened with the patience of one who knew that in gossip, truth often hid like a pearl within an oyster, buried but gleaming if one knew how to look. At the dressmaker's, she overheard Mrs. Finch scolding her husband in a low, sharp voice. "You'll keep away from the public house, do you hear? Folks are watching." Mr. Finch's reply was curt, almost threatening. He caught Miss Marple's glance and forced a stiff smile, but his eyes betrayed unease. Later, at the vicarage, Mrs. Weatherby, never shy with information, poured tea and leaned closer. "It's not just Trumbull who owed money, Jane. Half the village did in one way or another. Pritchard kept a little book, so they say. Names, amounts, even threats. If that book's gone missing, I shouldn't wonder it's the cause of all this." Miss Marple's brows rose slightly. A missing account book. That could prove dangerous indeed. By afternoon, she walked again past the post office, where Dr. Hartley tended to the injured Trumbull. "He'll live," the doctor told her grimly, though the blow nearly finished him. Someone wanted him silent, Jane, and badly. On her way home, she paused at Crooked Lane. A cart rattled past, and in the dust she noticed a faint trail of blue fibers, so faint they might have gone unseen by most. The same blue as before. Someone, it seemed, had passed this way more than once. As the church bells rang for evensong, Miss Marple sat by her fire, knitting calmly, though her mind was anything but calm. There were threads everywhere now. Arthur with his quarrels and protestations of innocence. Mr. Finch, the jealous husband, his temper quick and dangerous. Trumbull, bound up in debts and nearly murdered for what he might reveal. And the mysterious absence of Pritchard's little account book. Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily. A pattern was forming, though faint and unfinished. She knew from long experience that patience was required. Threads, after all, only revealed their design when woven together. But she also knew this. Someone in Willowbrook was growing desperate. And desperation in a murderer could be the most dangerous thread of all. Open book Miss Marple and Murder in the Mystery of the Crooked Lane. Chapter 8: A Whispered Confession. Rain fell softly over Willowbrook the next morning, making the cobblestones glisten like polished glass. Villagers scurried beneath umbrellas, but inside the bakery, conversation simmered hotter than the oven itself. Miss Marple, seated in her usual corner with a currant bun, heard Mrs. Tompkins declare, "Mark my words, Jane, whoever struck poor Trumbull will strike again. It's in the air. I feel it." Miss Marple smiled gently but said nothing. She had noticed, however, that Mrs. Finch entered quietly, her eyes darting, her hands twisting her gloves into knots. When the room thinned, Mrs. Finch crossed to Miss Marple's table, pale and trembling. "May I sit?" she whispered. "Of course, my dear," Miss Marple said kindly. For a moment, Mrs. Finch seemed unable to speak. Then, in a rush, "It wasn't Arthur." "I know it wasn't. Henry Pritchard. He was cruel, but Arthur's no killer." She looked around nervously before leaning closer. "My husband. He hated Pritchard. They quarreled, dreadful quarrels. Once I feared he might strike him. But if you tell Briggs, he'll turn on me. You don't know what he's like when angered." Miss Marple laid a gentle hand on hers. "Sometimes," she said softly, "the greatest courage lies in speaking what we fear most." Mrs. Finch blinked back tears, then rose quickly, leaving the bakery without another word. Later that day, Miss Marple visited Mr. Trumbull at the doctor's house, where he lay pale but conscious. His voice was weak, but when she mentioned Pritchard's account book, his eyes widened. He tried to speak but only managed a hoarse whisper, "Gone, someone took it," before falling into a weary sleep. Outside, the rain had stopped, but the air carried a chill. Miss Marple paused in Crooked Lane once more, her gaze resting on the crooked wall where shadows clung stubbornly. A jealous husband, a missing account book, villagers weighed down by debts and grudges. Yes, the pattern was beginning to emerge. But patterns, she knew, could deceive. And in Willowbrook, even a whispered confession might hide more than it revealed. Open book Miss Marple and Murder in the Mystery of the Crooked Lane. Chapter 9, The Clue in the Dark. The night in Willowbrook was unusually still. Clouds blotted out the moon, and the village lay in a hush so deep that even the owls seemed reluctant to stir. Miss Marple, unable to sleep, took her knitting to the sitting room, but the clicking of needles could not silence her thoughts. At 11:30 she heard it, a faint sound, a hurried footstep upon the lane. She set her knitting aside, drew her shawl around her shoulders, and moved to the window. Crooked Lane lay in shadow, but there, just beyond the crooked wall, someone slipped by, moving swiftly and without a lantern. Curiosity piqued. Miss Marple lit a small lamp and stepped into the night. She followed at a careful distance, her steps soft upon the damp earth. The figure disappeared near the abandoned miller's shed at the edge of the lane. When she reached the shed, all was silent once more. Yet in the weak glow of her lamp, she noticed something half buried in the mud near the door. A torn scrap of fabric, dark blue, its edge ragged as if wrenched away in a struggle. Her eyes narrowed. Blue fibers again. She tucked the cloth into her reticule and stepped closer. Inside the shed, the air was damp and musty. An old oil lantern leaned against the wall, recently used, its wick blackened with fresh soot. And on the ground, faint but visible, the imprint of boots, heavy, broad-soled, not unlike those worn by Mr. Finch. The distant toll of the church clock struck midnight. Miss Marple stood very still, her heart steady, her mind turning swiftly. Someone had been meeting here, perhaps hiding something. And whatever secrets the miller's shed contained, they were closely tied to the mystery of Henry Pritchard's death. As she made her way home through the silent village, she thought again of Mrs. Finch's whispered words, of Mr. Trumbull's broken warning, and of the missing account book. The darkness of the night seemed to mirror the darkness still lingering in Willowbrook. But Miss Marple, with her keen eyes and quiet patience, had seen a light, a clue in the dark. Open book Miss Marple and Murder in the Mystery of the Crooked Lane. Chapter 10, Shadows of the Past. The following morning brought a pale, watery sun to Willowbrook, as though the village itself were weary of darkness. Miss Marple walked slowly to the post office, a place where news often arrived disguised as trivial chatter. Behind the counter, young Emily Carter seemed distracted. Normally brisk and cheerful, she dropped coins twice and fumbled with the ledger. When the shop cleared, she leaned closer to Miss Marple and lowered her voice. "Miss Marple, there's something I think you ought to know. Not that it's my place, of course, but, well, secrets have a way of festering." Miss Marple smiled encouragingly. "Go on, my dear." Emily swallowed. Years ago, before he married Mrs. Finch, Mr. Finch was, well, rather entangled with Mrs. Pritchard. People whispered about it, though nothing was proved. It ended badly. There were dreadful rows. Some say Henry Pritchard never forgave him. And Mrs. Finch, Well, she's had to live in that shadow ever since. Miss Marple's eyes softened. And Mrs. Finch knows of it? Oh yes, Emily said quickly, her voice dropping further. She's known all along. That's why she's always so nervous. Some evenings she came here, eyes red from crying. I shouldn't tell you this, but once she said, "The past never stays buried, does it?" As Miss Marple walked back toward her cottage, the revelation tugged at her thoughts. So Mr. Finch had once quarreled bitterly with Henry Pritchard over a woman. Old passions, old jealousies. How often they lay dormant, only to erupt years later with deadly force. Later that day, she visited Dr. Hartley to deliver a basket of scones. While he fussed with the kettle, Miss Marple's eyes wandered to his study shelf, where a pile of unpaid bills lay conspicuously beneath a paperweight. She noticed the bold signature, H. Pritchard. Henry was rather a usurer, the doctor admitted when he caught her glance. I owed him myself. He lent freely, but at a price. If Trumbull had not been attacked, I dare say more than half the village would have found themselves in court before year's end. Miss Marple's gaze drifted toward the window, where the crooked lane curved in shadow. The past and present wove together like strands of her knitting. Old passions, old debts, old grievances. In Willowbrook, shadows of the past were long indeed, and one of them had reached forward to commit murder. Open book Miss Marple and Murder in the Mystery of the Crooked Lane. Chapter 11. A Second Shock. The peace of Willowbrook did not last long. Just as villagers began to whisper that perhaps the worst was over, another calamity struck. It happened on a damp Tuesday evening. The bell at St. Mildred's had just tolled 8 when a cry shattered the air near the green. Miss Marple, who had been reading quietly by lamplight, set down her book and hurried outside with surprising speed for her age. A small crowd had gathered by the smithy. There on the ground lay Mr. Arthur Finch, his coat torn, his face ashen, his breath shallow. Blood stained his temple where he had been struck. Dr. Hartley arrived within minutes, summoned by a frantic boy. He bent over the injured man, then looked up grimly. Alive, but only just. A heavy blow. He'll need watching. Where did you find him? Miss Marple asked quietly. By Crooked Lane, Mrs. Tompkins answered, wringing her hands. He was staggering toward the smithy when he fell. Miss Marple's sharp eyes swept the faces of those around her. Mrs. Finch stood apart, trembling, eyes wide with shock, or was it guilt? Mr. Trumbull, still weak but upright with a cane, had come hobbling from his cottage, his gaze fixed on the scene with a curious mixture of fear and anger. Another attack, someone cried. The murderer walks free among us still. Later, as the crowd dispersed and Arthur Finch was carried to his home, Miss Marple lingered in Crooked Lane. There, half hidden beneath the crooked wall, her lamp revealed a curious object, a brass key, its head engraved with the letters H.P. Henry Pritchard. Miss Marple held it delicately, her mind already working. A second blow, a second victim, or perhaps a man silenced before he could speak. As the night closed in around Willowbrook, she felt it clearly now. The murderer was growing desperate. And desperation, she knew, often made people careless. Open book Miss Marple and Murder in the Mystery of the Crooked Lane. Chapter 12. The Key to Secrets. The next morning dawned clear, as though the heavens wished to wipe away the terror of the night before. Yet within Willowbrook, unease curled like smoke. Miss Marple sat at her writing desk, the brass key before her. Its surface gleamed dully in the morning light, the letters H.P. etched firmly into the metal. Henry Pritchard had possessed it, of that she was certain. But to what did it belong? She slipped the key into her reticule and paid a visit to Sergeant Briggs, who was still bustling about the green, barking orders to constables. Another dreadful business, ma'am, Briggs muttered, red-faced. If Finch dies, that'll be 2 men down in less than a fortnight. But I'll have the culprit soon enough. You mark my words. Miss Marple inclined her head politely. Yes, Sergeant. Though sometimes the truth hides in plain sight. Tell me, was anything missing from Mr. Pritchard's rooms after his death? Nothing but that dashed account book, Briggs grumbled. Search high and low, can't find it anywhere. Nasty fellow he was, kept half the village in his pocket. Miss Marple smiled faintly and went on her way. By late afternoon, she found herself once more in Crooked Lane. A small stone outbuilding clung to the wall's crooked bend, an old storehouse, long unused. She tried the rusted lock. It resisted. Then, with a steady hand, she slipped in the brass key. It turned smoothly. Inside, the air was musty, thick with the scent of damp wood. Cobwebs shrouded the beams. Yet upon a rickety table lay a small iron box, locked but recently handled. Miss Marple's fingers brushed dust away, revealing faint scratches on the lid, as if someone had tried hurriedly to pry it open. She did not tamper further. Instead, she closed the door carefully and tucked the knowledge into her orderly mind. Back at her cottage, she reflected over her knitting. A hidden storehouse, a missing account book, an iron box, and a key left behind in the lane where Arthur Finch was struck. Yes, someone had grown reckless. And now, Miss Marple thought gently, the murderer's secrets were beginning to unravel, stitch by careful stitch. Open book Miss Marple and Murder in the Mystery of the Crooked Lane. Chapter 13, The Iron Box. That evening, Willowbrook seemed unusually restless. Curtains twitched more often than usual, and groups lingered in hushed tones outside the post office. The second attack had stirred fear to fever pitch, and now every villager saw shadows where none existed. Miss Marple, meanwhile, sat with her tea, calmly considering the matter of the iron box. She had not forced it open. It was not her way. She believed firmly that the truth always had a way of revealing itself, if one waited with patience. Her opportunity arrived sooner than she expected. At dusk, Mrs. Finch came to visit, her face pale, hands fluttering nervously. "Miss Marple," she whispered, "they say Arthur may not recover. And if he dies—" She broke off, wringing her handkerchief. Miss Marple poured her a steadying cup of tea. "My dear, have courage. Tell me, why was your husband near Crooked Lane last night?" Mrs. Finch's lips trembled. "He said he was meeting someone. Someone who had something that belonged to Henry. Papers. He wouldn't tell me more. But I know it troubled him dreadfully." Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly. Papers. Yes, an account book or records, locked away in an iron box. And Arthur Finch, who once quarreled with Henry Pritchard, had gone to fetch them, only to be struck down. Later that night, Miss Marple walked once again to the crooked storehouse. She stood in the shadows, shawl drawn tight against the chill. A lantern's glow flickered suddenly through the cracks in the wood. Someone was inside. She waited, listening. A scraping noise, a muttered curse, the sound of metal against metal. Then the lantern went dark. When at last the figure slipped out, Miss Marple saw enough in the moonlight, the stooped shape of Mr. Trumbull, cane in hand, moving swiftly despite his supposed weakness. She did not follow, only observed, her eyes thoughtful. The iron box had drawn yet another visitor. And Miss Marple knew, with the quiet certainty of long practice, that within that box lay the true heart of the mystery, a heart beating with greed, betrayal, and perhaps murder. Open book Miss Marple and Murder in the Mystery of the Crooked Lane. Chapter 14. What the Box Hid. The next morning, news rippled quietly through Willowbrook. Arthur Finch had survived the night. Weak but alive. The villagers breathed easier, though fear still lingered in their eyes. Miss Marple, however, thought not of Arthur's condition but of the storehouse and the iron box within. She rose early, shawl about her shoulders, and walked to Crooked Lane, where dew still clung to the hedges. The door yielded once more to the brass key. Inside, the box remained upon the table, but something was different. Its lid stood ajar. Miss Marple approached carefully. With gloved hands, she lifted it open. Inside lay a stack of papers, tied with fraying string. The top sheet bore Henry Pritchard's bold hand. Ledger of accounts, private. Miss Marple leafed through. Names leapt out at her. Dr. Hartley, Mrs. Finch, even young Emily Carter's brother. Debts, signatures, threats of foreclosure. And in the margins, Pritchard's notes. Cruel observations about each debtor, secrets they would never want made public. Beneath the ledger, a smaller bundle of letters lay. These she examined with a sharper eye. They were love letters. Passionate, reckless. signed with initials that made her pause. Forever yours, A.F. Arthur Finch. The pieces knitted together swiftly. Henry Pritchard had not only held the village in financial chains, he had also kept proof of old sins, waiting for the right moment to twist the knife. No wonder half the village might wish him dead. Miss Marple retied the string and replaced the bundle. As she closed the box, a sound made her turn. A figure stood in the doorway, Mr. Trumbull, cane in hand, eyes sharp despite his pallor. "You shouldn't be here, Miss Marple," he said softly. His voice carried an edge she had not heard before. "These matters are dangerous." Miss Marple regarded him calmly. "Dangerous indeed, Mr. Trumbull. Especially for those who have something to lose." For a long moment, their eyes met in the dim light. Then Trumbull gave a tight smile, tipped his hat and walked away, leaving the scent of suspicion heavy in the air. Miss Marple lingered, her mind already working. The box had yielded its secrets. But secrets, she knew, were like sparks. Once loosed, they could set an entire village aflame. Open book Miss Marple and Murder in the Mystery of the Crooked Lane. Chapter 15, Suspicions in the Air. Willowbrook was never a quiet village when there was news to be whispered, and after 2 attacks and a murder, gossip clung to the air thicker than the summer mist. At the grocer's, Mrs. Perry declared loudly that Dr. Hartley had been seen arguing with Henry Pritchard only days before the murder. At the post office, Mr. Webb swore he'd heard voices raised near Crooked Lane on the very night Arthur Finch was struck down. Even the vicar's wife, usually above such talk, admitted in hushed tones that Mrs. Finch had been terribly distraught of late. Miss Marple, moving quietly from shop to shop, gathered every word. She never dismissed gossip. In her experience, it was like wool, messy, tangled, but with the right patience it could be spun into a clear thread. That afternoon, she called upon Dr. Hartley. His study smelled of pipe tobacco and books, but his manner was unusually sharp. "Really, Miss Marple," he said, polishing his spectacles, "this village thrives on scandal. Yes, Pritchard and I quarreled, but over a matter of accounts, nothing more." "Of course," Miss Marple said gently. "Yet I do wonder. Was he in possession of something you would rather not have become public?" The doctor's hand trembled just slightly before he set down his pipe. "You are a sharp woman, Miss Marple. But some things are best left buried." When she returned to the lane, a new disturbance awaited. Constable Miller stood outside the Finch house, pale-faced. "There's been a robbery, ma'am," he blurted. "The room where Mr. Finch lies. Someone broke in during the night. Searched it from top to bottom. Nothing taken but his papers." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed ever so slightly. Papers again. Always papers. She turned her steps homeward, knitting bag swinging at her side. The murderer was tightening their hold, desperate to seize every trace of Pritchard's secrets. Yet in desperation she knew mistakes were made, and one such mistake would lead them straight into her waiting hands. Open book Miss Marple and Murder in the Mystery of the Crooked Lane. Chapter 16. Miss Marple Sets a Trap. Miss Marple had seen it too many times before. Guilt seldom revealed itself through grand gestures. No, it slipped out in the smallest of ways. A twitch of the eye, a hurried word, a silence too long held. That evening, she invited a small gathering to her cottage under the pretext of sharing tea and scones. Present were Dr. Hartley, Mrs. Finch, Mr. Trumbull, and young Emily Carter, who had been delivering groceries nearby. It was an odd assortment, but Miss Marple explained it away with a sweet smile. The kettle whistled, cups were poured, and the conversation turned, quite deliberately, to Henry Pritchard. "It's curious," Miss Marple began lightly, "that he should have kept such careful records. That iron box of his, full of names and figures. Why, if such a box were found, it might tell us everything about his enemies, don't you think?" The reaction was instantaneous. Mrs. Finch's hand jerked, spilling tea upon her lap. Dr. Hartley coughed violently into his handkerchief. Emily Carter went pale, eyes darting between them. Only Mr. Trumbull sat very still, his cane tapping once against the floor. Miss Marple observed each movement, her kindly eyes giving away nothing. "Of course," she went on smoothly, "the box is quite safe. Hidden, I dare say, where only the cleverest might find it. But whoever knew of it, well, they must be feeling rather uneasy now. Silence fell. The clock ticked loudly on the mantelpiece. Then, quite unexpectedly, Mr. Trumbull spoke. "Some things, Miss Marple, are better left undisturbed. Digging too deep may only bring harm." His words hung heavy in the air, and for a moment even the fire seemed to burn lower. But Miss Marple only smiled faintly, as though she had been told a harmless riddle. Inwardly, though, she knew her trap had worked. Each reaction had revealed more than any confession could. Someone in that room had tried to silence Arthur Finch. Someone feared the iron box enough to kill. And Miss Marple, with her quiet certainty, was now closer than ever to the truth. Open book Miss Marple and Murder in the Mystery of the Crooked Lane. Chapter 17. Shadows in the Night. The village of Willowbrook lay cloaked in silence that night, the kind of silence that unsettled the nerves. Even the owls seemed reluctant to call. But Miss Marple, wakeful as ever, sat by her bedroom window with her knitting in her lap. She had learned long ago that truth often stirred after dark. Her patience was rewarded. Shortly past midnight, she noticed a flicker of movement along Crooked Lane. A figure, hooded and quick, slipped between the hedgerows, carrying what looked like a lantern dimmed with cloth. Miss Marple rose quietly, fetched her shawl, and stepped into the cool air. She did not follow directly. No, that would be far too obvious. Instead, she kept to the shadows, letting her years of village life guide her where the lanes twisted and narrowed. At the old storehouse, the figure halted. Miss Marple saw the glint of metal as a lock was forced. The door creaked open, and the lantern glow revealed the intruder rifling furiously inside. A sudden clatter broke the stillness. The intruder froze, then fled into the darkness, leaving the lantern overturned. Miss Marple approached cautiously. Inside, the iron box lay open again, papers scattered across the floor. But this time, something new caught her eye. A small knife, dropped in haste, its handle engraved with a single letter, H. She bent, picked it up, and slipped it into her pocket. Her sharp eyes swept the ground, noticing the tracks leading back toward the village, the limp in the stride unmistakable. When dawn came, Willowbrook awoke to whispers of another disturbance. Some swore they had seen Mr. Trumbull limping through the green at an ungodly hour, his cane striking unevenly upon the cobbles. Miss Marple said nothing, but in her heart, she knew the shadows of the night had revealed more than enough. The killer was closing in on himself, step by desperate step. Open book Miss Marple and Murder in the Mystery of the Crooked Lane. Chapter 18. The Net Tightens. The morning after the disturbance, Willowbrook seemed restless. Villagers clustered outside the post office, the inn, even by the church gate, voices lowered but urgent. They say the storehouse was broken into again. Someone saw Mr. Trumbull out late, but he swears he was ill. And what of Dr. Hartley? He looked dreadful this morning, as if he hadn't slept a wink. Miss Marple, moving with quiet steps, heard it all. To the untrained ear, it was merely gossip. To her, it was the tightening of threads in a net only she could see. By mid-morning, she sat with Constable Miller in her neat parlor. He listened with wide eyes as she described the knife, the initials upon it, and the limping figure. "You believe it was Mr. Trumbull, ma'am?" he asked. Miss Marple's needles clicked gently. "I believe, Constable, that appearances are most useful things, for those who wish to mislead. A limp, for example, may be genuine, or it may be feigned." Miller frowned. "Then you think it wasn't him?" "I think," Miss Marple said softly, "that someone wishes us to believe so. Which makes me ask, who stands to gain if suspicion falls upon Mr. Trumbull?" Later that day, she visited Mrs. Finch. The woman looked worn and pale, her eyes shadowed. "Poor Arthur," she murmured, wringing her hands. "He mutters even in his sleep. Terrible things. Secrets Henry kept. I only pray no one else suffers." Miss Marple regarded her kindly. "Secrets, dear, have a way of doing the most dreadful harm when they are written down." At the door, Miss Marple paused, noticing a faint stain upon the woman's sleeve. Ink smudged hastily, as if from recent writing. By evening, Miss Marple had returned home, mind whirring. The iron box, the letters, the debts, the knife, each clue was a thread, and slowly, inexorably, the web was drawing tight. Soon, she knew, the killer would make a final desperate move. And she would be waiting. Open book Miss Marple and Murder in the Mystery of the Crooked Lane. Chapter 19. A Desperate Move. The village lay heavy with unease. News of the storehouse break-in had not yet faded when another whisper spread. Someone had tried to enter Miss Marple's own garden in the night. Constable Miller found the gate unlatched and footprints pressed deep into the damp earth. He shook his head gravely. "It seems, ma'am, someone doesn't like the questions you've been asking." Miss Marple, seated by the hearth, only smiled faintly. When a spider feels its web tremble, Constable, it grows restless. And this spider knows the strands are closing in. That evening, she chose not to remain indoors. Instead, she walked deliberately toward Crooked Lane, her knitting bag upon her arm. The air was damp, the lane deserted, and yet, she felt the eyes upon her. From behind the hedgerow, a shadow darted. Rough hands seized her arm, dragging her toward the ditch. A low voice hissed, "You meddle too much, old woman. Best keep silent if you value your life." But Miss Marple, far from panicked, let her bag fall open. Needles and yarn scattered across the ground, tangling around the attacker's legs. With a startled curse, the figure stumbled, releasing her arm. A lantern flashed. Constable Miller and young Emily Carter rushed forward. Miss Marple had sent for them quietly earlier, predicting such a move. The attacker bolted into the darkness, but not before the lantern light caught a clear glimpse. The sharp line of a jaw, a coat sleeve torn at the cuff. "Dr. Hartley." "Did you see, Constable?" Miss Marple's voice was calm though her heart beat fast. "It seems our physician has been making rather desperate house calls." Miller stared at her in astonishment. "But why, ma'am? Why him?" Miss Marple looked toward the shadows where the man had fled. "Because Henry Pritchard knew too much. And Dr. Hartley, I fear, had more to lose than anyone else in Willowbrook." Open book Miss Marple and Murder in the Mystery of the Crooked Lane. Chapter 20. The Gathering Storm. Rain swept across Willowbrook the next day, a gray curtain that blurred the lanes and turned the village green into a mire. Yet the storm outside was nothing compared to the storm building among the people. At the grocer's, Mrs. Harbottle leaned close to whisper, "They say Dr. Hartley was seen near Miss Marple's garden last night. Can you imagine?" At the inn, men shook their heads gravely. A respectable doctor hiding such things? Well, Henry Pritchard had enemies enough. Debts, blackmail, secrets. And if the doctor was mixed in it, everywhere Miss Marple went, she heard it. Like thunder rolling nearer, suspicion was gathering, ready to break. That afternoon, she invited Constable Miller once again to her cottage. The iron box now sat upon her table, its lock forced but contents carefully arranged. Miss Marple's hands smoothed over the faded papers. "You see, Constable," she said gently, "Henry Pritchard's records tell us far more than who owed him money. They tell us who was most desperate." She laid out the evidence. Letters from Dr. Hartley, pleading for more time to repay large sums. Notes about Mrs. Finch, suggesting she too knew secrets better left hidden. A list of names, each with a figure beside it, yet one entry was violently scratched out. "Why scratch out a name?" Miss Marple murmured. "Unless that person had already paid their price?" Constable Miller frowned. So it was Hartley after all? Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly. Perhaps. But notice the ink. 2 hands have written here. One smooth, practiced, a physician's perhaps. The other, hurried, uneven, nervous. It seems our little box has been touched by more than one guilty soul. Outside, thunder cracked, and the rain struck harder against the glass. Miss Marple's eyes were calm, but her voice was low. "The storm is gathering, Constable. Before it breaks, we must be ready. For I fear the killer will not sit quietly and wait for justice.